Okay, so thank you all for coming. By way of my interest and background, since I'm talking to technical people, I'll just say that the only thing I want to say about my background is that I have traumatic memories from the 1980s of programming in RPG2. If anybody knows what that means, I'll say no more. Okay, I want to talk a bit about what I'm working on at the moment, and I've really got my sociologist hat on, and I'm interested in geek culture as a storytelling culture. Now, why a storytelling culture? Well, I've spent the last 2 or 3 years looking at the range of representations of geeks in media, on film, popular biography, and a few academic works, but also looking at blogs and journals in my particular area of interest, which is the dying area of desktop Linux. But I've buried a few platforms in my time. I used to have a Scion, and I remember Symbian well, so I'm okay with being attached to a dying platform. But the approach in this work, which I expect to have, I hope my editor's not here tonight, but I did promise to hand in a manuscript to Paul Grave a month ago. That work, I called it Challenging Code, and I subtitled it, as I last remember, Stories by and about geeks, hackers, gamers. Now, who are geeks for me? Geeks are technology enthusiasts, and I don't think I need to say more. In my work, I focus largely on computer geeks, with a particular leaning towards people interested in the world of free and open source software, because this project is partly autobiographical. I'm working and writing on something that interests me. I also have an interest in narrative. Why geek culture is a storytelling culture? For 2 reasons. One, the way in which geeks are represented in popular culture is as lying somewhere, I don't want to offend anybody, on the autistic spectrum, and I have my issues with that. I think it's just plain wrong, or people who are technical geniuses, but invariably people who lack social skills. So that stereotype runs and runs. And it needs to be challenged. But also, I also take geek culture seriously in the sense that geeks collectively have a self-understanding of what it is to be a geek, and they do tell stories, and they've got their own historiography, their own body of writing about their own history. And that's the aspect of the work I want to talk to you about tonight. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to say a little bit about my methods and data, and then I want to talk about a particular literary figure, the Epiphany. I remember from my Bible study days, I'm a lapsed Anglican, yes, but I'll explain how I use Epiphany and how we use it when we do narrative analysis. So for me, what is written about geeks and geek culture, and what geeks write about who they are, and what they do and their origins is my raw material. So I'm analyzing these narratives. The Epiphany, a crucial turning point, is one figure, but also schisms. And I'll say a little bit about schismogenesis, a term, if you're familiar with cybernetics, you know it's got its own particular history there. But I'll talk to you about how we use it in anthropology, because I've also got that hat as well, an anthropology hat. I'm middle-aged, I've been around for a while, so I've done a few things. In terms of my method, I have been involved in personal computing since 1982, I repeat. I had an ICL personal computer with a 5¼ inch floppy drive. I remember it well. It was floppy if you shook it like that. But more to the point, when I get on to talking about Linux and Unix, I first encountered Unix in its Xenix version around 1986. I think it might have been the Santa Cruz organization. I should go like that and, you know, ward off evil spirits when I mention It might even have been a Microsoft version of Xenix. I don't recall, but I recall it was a 386 version of... So I find myself now trying to reintegrate these two parts of my own biography. I was a geek first, then I became a sociologist, and now I'm trying to write sociologically about geek culture. I'll talk a lot about narrative, and I could bore you on that, but I won't. Let's just suffice to say, I want you to bear two things in mind when I talk about narrative. A narrative isn't only about a story that's told, it's also about the packaging up and presenting a story. So you've got to make decisions around characterization and plotting and pacing when you narrate. And I personally find it quite engaging to reconstruct the kinds of decisions that are made in geek narratives. So, the epiphany then. There is an historiography of geek culture. Speaking from an academic perspective, one of the best recent works is Menger's, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, called The Computer Boys Take Over. And it's a fascinating history of computing, probably a bit US-centric. I'm very happy to talk about that later on. Let me just bracket off by saying I recently put in a proposal for a history of science computing, and the American editor got back to me and said he didn't think it would work because it was too provincial. But I'll leave that for, we can probably talk about that in the question and answer session. So, there is an historiography. There is an organized body of writing about computer geek culture. Yes, I mentioned Menger's work, and there are others, but these are all academic works. What we have for every academic work on computer geek culture, we have at least 10. I'm just chucking numbers out here, but it's, you know, what with Brexit, you know, we're at a moment in history when you can just throw numbers out. But however many academic histories of geek computer culture there are many more popular histories, and they tend to focus around the founders of tech firms, you know, from Jobs and Gates through to Zuckerberg, sex, drugs, rock and roll, the foundation of Facebook, etc., etc. This is an interesting literature, and I'll devote one chapter in my work to analyzing it, but I'm not going to speak about that today. I want to talk about the epiphany. In biblical studies, an epiphany is a moment. So I believe it was St. Paul had his epiphany on the road to Damascus. So it's a point in your life when you're confronted by the need to make a decision, and you make a turning, and then your life looks differently after that. Epiphanies are recurrent in narrations of geek culture. They're dramatic pivot points, and they serve to simplify messy and complex histories, focusing in on individuals, small groups, and the eureka moment. The notion of the eureka moment is something which historians of science debate about. Do we understand scientific breakthroughs as a eureka moment? And do we reduce this to the individual genius? I'll come back to that in geek culture later on. There are a range of dramatic conventions that are used for rendering epiphanies in mainstream film and fictional representations of geek culture. As an example, I point to the character assassination, otherwise known as the Fifth Estate. Yes? And I don't know what one would have learned from the Fifth Estate about the politics of data privacy and WikiLeaks, but it was reduced in terms of conventional plotting into a story about a tortured hero. But anyway, let's move on. The accidental discovery, the late night breakthrough, these are all recurrent epiphanies. Let's take two examples, two foundational epiphanies in geek culture. I won't go into detail because everyone in this room would no doubt be familiar. The first, of course, has got Steve Jobs visiting the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. And this has been dealt with on screen in two recent, and it's recurrent. I think the best treatment of it is probably in Nicholson's When Computing Got personal. At least as an academic, I'm satisfied that Nicholson did some research. But anyway, we know how that story goes. Jobs sees the GUI, he has a breakthrough revelation, and then we have the Lisa and the Mac, and the rest is history. And then there's the contemporaneous breakthrough that's recurrent in popular histories of geek culture. In 1980, Bill Gates manages to elbow Gary Kildall aside. We don't know whether Kildall was flying his aircraft or not. They're different accounts. But again, this episode is narrated as all about serendipity and a breakthrough. Yes, these two incidents are in fact not nearly as singular and decisive as they've been rendered in popular representations of geek culture, and indeed even in some more serious works. Nicholson certainly has looked into this and has interviewed other people who were present at this, and there wasn't just one meeting of Steve Jobs with the people at Park. There were several meetings. There were more people implicated and more events. But why would this way of narrating the story even be important? Well, it's partly to simplify a complex range of issues, and I'll put this down to come back to it in the question and answer session. An obsession with breakthrough moments and singular individuals serves to justify a particular ideological tendency in geek culture, which some people refer to as cyber techno-libertarianism. Yes, the notion of the geek as a singular genius is tied in to strategies that attempt to justify the huge amounts of money that particular geek stars earn. So it may seem to be a crude way of plotting, but it is functional to plot the singular breakthrough and the history. Now, with respect to so that's and I devote a fair bit of time in my project to illuminating different kinds of epiphanies in geek storytelling, and to make informed guesses as to what function they might serve. Sometimes ideological, sometimes they serve to fill in gaps in a story. I want to say a little bit about schismogenesis, process of the making of divisions. And I take the view in my work that geek culture is fundamentally and inherently schismogenetic. This has partly to do with a number of characteristics of geek culture, and I'll come to these. I'll come to these shortly. But back to historiography for a moment. This is why Steve Jobs said the finger is better than the pen for manipulating a touch interface. Just bear with me while I scroll this down. Okay, so let's come back to these two founding figures, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs again. And I want to focus for a moment on an initial divide which is often personified in these two. Divide one, or schism one, yes, which has to do with Bill Gates's famous, as you know, letter to hobbyists, in which he, in 1975, when he argued that people had a right to earn a living from their software, and he took issue with the homebrew computing club's copying of his BASIC interpreter. That is arguably the most fundamental schism in geek culture. But I'm happy to take other offers. But I think it's perhaps the most fundamental schism, because it is the divide that also allows us to make a space for Richard Stallman, for example. And I don't have time to talk about it now, but I also look in my work at a very important schism in software licensing, not just between the GPL and the lesser GPL in terms of the affordances and what is entailed and what are you required to share, but crucially between GPL type and BSD licenses. This is another important schism here, and of course it is the affordances of the BSD license which allowed Apple and Sony to build, particularly in the case of Apple, hugely profitable platforms. And I am from that wing of geek culture which thinks that Apple, Sony, and Google have taken far more from the commons than they have returned in value. They were allowed to do so because of the BSD license. But there is a schism in geek culture around software licensing. It doesn't make its way into some of the more popular representations that I looked at, but it's an area of more specific debate. So that's the second schism. Yes. A third one, less recognized, but I think really important. A third schism has to do with Steve Jobs' decision to close the Macintosh hardware and to move away from an open platform. And here, of course, Gates and IBM were on the side of the angels, really. One problem I find being my age and trying to talk about and teach the history of a culture of personal computing to 19 or 20-year-olds is they haven't got an appreciation of these issues, and more to the point, their own understanding has been shaped by particular narratives which are not just ones which we could debate and challenge, but some of which are outright false, such as Apple inventing the smartphone. These things matter to me, yes? They may not matter to other people, but these things do matter. Anyway, so another key schism in geek culture, which shapes geek historiography, has to do with Steve Jobs' decision to close the Macintosh hardware. In general, in geek culture, in geek computer culture, one side will seize, for example, on specs or a feature change or a new benchmark. You assail the opponent with the results. The opponents then seek out spec or feature changes or mods or benchmarks. Let's exemplify this. I spent a lot of time developing a case around benchmarking Adobe's Creative Suite on the newest Macintosh. Now, as people in this room will know, Adobe optimize for NVIDIA and CUDA, but the latest Mac Pro runs AMD hardware, and I believe the graphical platform there might be OpenCL, for which the Adobe suite is not so well optimized. I've collected and studied a body of debate amongst geeks around these things interest me, and I think they matter. The benchmarking of Adobe Creative Suite, partly because, and this is an important aspect of the theory of schismogenesis, it is similarity that generates difference. And when Apple's platform, when Apple moved to the Intel platform, a whole area of differentiation between Macs and PCs was removed. And in running the same platform, I think there's evidence to show that it intensified debate and quarreling in geek culture. But in any event, let's come back to benchmarking. So there are two ways of approaching this question of benchmarking Adobe Creative Suite. There are some tech sites, for example, AnandTech, where people with a background in engineering will explain the methodology of their benchmarks, and they'll take you through a whole range of tests, and they try to normalize the hardware. And then there's the other stuff on Reddit, where people just quarrel. But it isn't possible to perceive the performance difference between similarly spec'd recent Macs and PCs, both of which are running Adobe Creative software. in order to have that debate, you have to create a difference where no objective difference exists. If we move out of the specific technical domain of arguing about how to benchmark Adobe's Creative Suite using what I think would be reasonable control environments, we basically just have fanboys, and we have personal abuse and quarreling. But people fall back when they fail. What I found is, in geek culture, when the numbers fail you, you fall back on plotting using different kinds of dramatic stories. And of course, it is that dual sense of plot that drives a lot of my work. We plot numbers, obviously, as in a graph. But when that fails you, and it often does in arguments about benchmarking, because with all these thousands of benchmarking videos on YouTube, who knows what methodology they used? Does that stuff even make sense? Yes? Nonetheless, it matters in geek culture because it is part of what people have quarrels over. Okay, I want to move into one more case around schisms in geek culture. I want to talk about Miguel de Icaza and his move to Microsoft. I see a few smiles in the room now. If you're into desktop Linux, you will know that in 1996, Matthias Etrich, so it goes, German computer science student, decided that for Linux to gain widespread acceptance, it needed a GUI. And he started KDE. But, surprise, surprise, schism, KDE was not entirely GPL compliant at first. So a number of hackers, including Miguel de Icaza, they started the, is it GNOME or GNOME? I think it's GNOME, the GNOME project.
You're starting another argument here.
Yeah, oh dear, okay, so let's just say the project that Miguel de Icaza started. And the idea is that that GNOME would be entirely GPL compliant. Let me just read here, because I think I might be going off on too many tangents. So, as a GNOME founder, de Icaza was recognized as one of the leaders in free software. And then he announced that he was going to, people are probably familiar with this narrative, he was going to build a free software version of Microsoft's .NET runtime. And then there was a huge explosion. What's interesting for me about this story is how people articulated their respective positions. Let me sum it up here. So, his justification, yes, is that the .NET runtime was a good technology, which already meant that he was bridging a very important schism in geek culture, which is being anti-Microsoft. To be anti-Microsoft is to be consistently and unapologetically opposed to anything that Microsoft does. Their technologies are demonstrably inferior. Yes? So, for him to declare that it was worthwhile to do this opened up an enormous schism. I say enormous because in my world these are big issues, and in the work I'm doing, yes, I hope for some of you think they're at least significant. He attracted the ire of many people that's stating not only that Microsoft's .NET technology was good, but that actually competent hackers were employed by Microsoft. Now, it seems to me that this is, to say that Microsoft employs competent hackers seems to me to be a quite unexceptional statement. In fact, Microsoft employs as many more computer science PhDs than most large universities. These facts are well known. Don't need to go. So, building his open source alternative to .NET required de Icaza to work with Microsoft, get information on how the platform worked, and apparently in so doing he found them cooperative. At the time that de Icaza was talking about his mini epiphany, finding out that they weren't all that bad at Microsoft, .NET was really a good technology, a counter-narrative was emerging about how he was being absorbed by the Borg. You know, that he was losing it, that he was being brainwashed, and these two narratives were working in parallel. Yes, moving ahead then, he even spoke positively, and he wrote on his blog repeatedly about his actual experience of working with Microsoft hackers. Against this, other open source hackers talked about, I don't know if he was a Trojan horse or he was deemed to be inside a Trojan horse, or was, I don't understand how that metaphor worked. I have to do some more work on how that was deployed. But in any event, there was an enormous explosion, as some of you will know, when he announced that the firm that he and Nat Friedman co-founded would actually be bought by Microsoft, and that he would go on to become a senior software engineer. There was intense negative reaction. Now, let's stop here and look at the facts. We know that Microsoft have contributed code to the Linux kernel. Yes, Crow-Hartman said that Greg Crow-Hartman said he was required, I've dug out this account, he said I was required to accept their code because it met all the requirements for submitting code to the Linux kernel. So I had to take this code. It was good code. It could be that Microsoft just wanted to make Linux more operable so that they could embrace and extend. These stories are out there in circulation. People in this room may know more about that than I do. But in any event, lost my thread. Where are we? Okay, yes. So people responded to the announcement that Icaza was going to fold. It had become by then Xamarin, hadn't it? Yes, cross-platform runtime, and he was going to fold this into Microsoft. It would become a Microsoft technology. People responded by retrospectively rendering accounts which purported to show how Icaza had made a wrong turn. And some of his opponents, and I go through some of this in my work, some of his opponents came up with evidence which they argued showed the points, various points at which Icaza turned the wrong way or made a deal with the devil, as it were. We aren't really talking about technology here. We can't understand these schisms by only talking about technology. They are about technology, but they can't be fully accounted for by talking only in and about technology. We have to have another framework to talk about these schisms. That's why I use narrative theory, storytelling, rhetoric. Sometimes battles are about specs and about gigahertz, and they're about how many data lines, your interface is able to deploy. But sometimes these debates are simply rhetorical engagements, and more often than not they are. Let me pull this together. Why take such an approach? Why bring a storytelling approach to geek culture? Partly because geek culture represents itself and is represented as technocratic. And technocratic is seen as the other from that which is touchy-feely, possibly emotive, maybe at some remove from storytelling. But there is no way to understand geek culture without, for example, engaging with the historiography of, for example, personal computing. There is an historiography. There are archives. There are documents. There are events. There are people. And we have to approach these in terms of established methods of doing history. It's not for geeks to tell us how to write a history of geek culture. That has to be done by sociologists or by historians, one. Two, a storytelling approach destabilizes some of what I think are the sometimes disingenuous moves around geek culture. I think Miguel de Icaza was unfairly treated, and I don't think there are any good engineering reasons for berating him as people did. I think some of his enemies should come clean and say that they dislike Microsoft. It's an ideological issue. But they insisted repeatedly that they had evidence that .NET was an inferior, a badly engineered platform. I know of, people in this room can help me, I know of no means to establish the truth of such an assertion. I don't think there's any means. And my use of storytelling I find useful as a means of countering that. It's like the carapace of a tortoise, the technology and the technocratic around geek culture. And it's almost hermetically sealed. And one way to penetrate it is to, what I try to do is I try to demonstrate that geek culture, like any other human activity, has to engage in storytelling, has to engage in arguments, has to engage in rhetorical combat. And to uncover this, I think geeks would also understand themselves better if they were less politically and theoretically naive. The last thing I want to say is, as I was once asked to leave a hackathon, yes, because I advanced the notion that the arguments about the relative merits of GPL versus BSD ultimately couldn't be settled on technological grounds. They had to be settled politically. And I was asked politely to leave. I think I'll end here. Thank you.